This is the moment everything fell into place. A wedding dress, a yacht full of champagne and diamonds, and one woman in a pink uniform who was about to change everything, without saying a single word. Nobody on that dock knew who she really was. Not the bride. Not the groom. Not even the man who owned the boat. By the end of this story, you'll understand why the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most powerful one in it. Stay with me, because what happens next will stay with you long after this video ends. Hey everyone, welcome back. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from today? Which country do you call home? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know who's here with me tonight. This is a story about pride, about being underestimated, and about a kindness so quiet that nobody noticed it until it was too late to take back. It's emotional, it's real, and it has a twist you will not see coming. Let's begin. The morning sun had barely risen over the marina when Denise Coleman arrived for work, the way she had every single day for the past 3 years. She wore her uniform, a simple pink dress with a white collar, an apron tied neatly at her waist, her curly hair pulled back into a bun that never quite behaved. She wasn't paid to be beautiful. She was paid to be invisible. That was the job. Denise worked as a housekeeper aboard the Whitmore family's private yacht, the Serenity, docked at one of the most exclusive marinas in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The boat itself was worth more than every house on the street where Denise grew up combined. 3 decks, gold fixtures, a crew of 12. And today, it had been transformed into something even grander, a floating wedding venue, dressed head to toe in white roses and cascading silk ribbons. Because today, Nathaniel Whitmore, sole heir to the Whitmore shipping empire, a man Forbes had once called the most eligible bachelor on the East Coast, was getting married. Denise had never met him. Not really. She'd seen him from a distance a handful of times, always in a suit, always on the phone, always moving like a man who had somewhere more important to be. The kind of man whose world and her world were never supposed to touch. She wasn't hired for the wedding. She was hired to clean before it, to make sure the lower decks, the crew quarters, the kitchen were spotless before the guests arrived. Her shift was supposed to end 2 hours before the ceremony even began. But nothing that day would go according to plan. At 7:14 that morning, as Denise scrubbed down the galley counters, she heard a soft, panicked whimper coming from behind a stack of folded linens near the crew stairwell. She almost ignored it. She had learned, in 3 years of working for wealthy families, that it was safer not to notice things that weren't her business. But the sound came again. Weaker this time. She knelt down and found a small gray kitten, soaked and shivering, tangled in a discarded length of ribbon that had somehow wrapped itself around its tiny leg. It must have slipped aboard from the dock overnight, chasing some smell of food, and gotten stuck. Denise didn't think. She never did in moments like this. She simply acted. She gently freed the kitten's leg, wrapped it in a clean kitchen towel, one she would later have to explain to the head chef, and held it against her chest until its shivering slowed. Its leg was cut, not badly, but enough to need attention. She should have left it. She should have called animal control or one of the marina staff, or simply set it down on the dock and gone back to her mop. That would have been the safe thing. The correct thing, according to the invisible rulebook she lived by every day at this job. Don't get involved, don't cause a scene, don't be noticed. Instead, she carried the kitten into the small first aid closet near the crew galley, cleaned its wound with gauze and antiseptic she wasn't technically authorized to use, and gently bandaged its leg with the kind of care most people saved for their own children. She didn't know in that moment that she was being watched. Nathaniel Whitmore had come down to the lower deck alone, seeking 5 minutes of quiet before the chaos of his own wedding swallowed him whole. He stood in the shadow of the stairwell, unnoticed, and watched a woman in a housekeeper's uniform tend to an injured animal with more tenderness than he had seen from anyone, including his own fiancée, in longer than he cared to admit. He didn't say anything. He simply watched. There was something about the way she spoke to the kitten, soft, low, reassuring. "You're okay, sweet thing. You're safe now. I've got you." That struck something loose in his chest. Something he hadn't expected to feel on the morning of his wedding. He turned and walked away before she noticed him. But he did not forget what he saw. Upstairs, the deck was already filling with 200 guests in tuxedos and gowns, waiters weaving between them with trays of champagne, a string quartet warming up near the bow. Everything gleamed. Everything sparkled. Everything looked absolutely perfect. Nobody, not one single guest, knew that the most important thing happening on that yacht that morning had already occurred. Quietly, 2 decks below, involving a kitten, a roll of gauze, and a woman nobody had bothered to learn the name of. By 9 a.m., Denise's official duties were finished. She was told, politely but firmly by the event coordinator, that she needed to be off the boat before guests began arriving in earnest. For the aesthetic, the woman had said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. Denise didn't argue. She never did. She gathered her cleaning supplies, tucked the kitten, now sleeping peacefully, bandaged leg and all, into a small box lined with a towel, intending to bring it to the marina's dockside office to see if anyone had lost it, and made her way toward the gangplank. She had no idea that in less than 3 hours, her name would be the only one anyone at that wedding was talking about. She had no idea that Nathaniel Whitmore had already made a decision, one that would append the day, the wedding, and everything his fiancé had spent 18 months planning. All Denise knew, as she stepped toward the exit with a box in her arms and her shift finally over, was that she wanted to go home, put her feet up, and forget about roses and champagne and a wedding that had nothing to do with her. She was wrong about that last part. It had everything to do with her. She just didn't know it yet. The wedding coordinator's name was Priscilla Vance, and she ran that yacht like a military operation. By 9:30 a.m., the Serenity was a symphony of controlled chaos. Florists adjusting the final rose arrangements along the railings, the string quartet running through the processional one last time, a photographer testing angles near the bow where the ceremony would take place with the Miami skyline glowing gold behind it. And at the center of it all stood the bride. Vanessa Caldwell was, by every objective measure, stunning. Her gown, custom, imported from Paris, worth more than most people's annual salary, flowed around her like liquid silk. Her hair had been styled for 4 hours that morning. Her makeup was flawless. She looked, everyone agreed, like something out of a fairy tale. But underneath the veil, Vanessa's mind was not on love. It was on optics. She had grown up the daughter of a mid-level real estate developer, comfortable but never truly wealthy. Not Whitmore wealthy. Marrying Nathaniel wasn't just a relationship to her. It was an ascension. A permanent upgrade to a life she had always believed she deserved, but had never quite reached on her own. She loved him in her own way. But she loved what he represented more. And this wedding, every flower, every guest, every second of it, had to be perfect, because perfect was the only acceptable outcome when the entire country club, the entire social circle she'd spent years clawing her way into, was watching. So when she looked down from the upper deck and saw a woman in a pink housekeeping uniform walking toward the gangplank carrying a cardboard box, something in her simply snapped. "Excuse me," Vanessa called out, her voice sharp enough to cut through the quartet's rehearsal. "Excuse me. You there?" Denise stopped, confused, looking up toward the upper deck where the bride stood in her full wedding regalia, several bridesmaids frozen mid-conversation beside her. "Yes, you," Vanessa said, stepping toward the railing, her voice rising. "What are you still doing on this boat?" The staff coordinator told everyone to be off by 9. "Guests are arriving in 20 minutes. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Denise said quietly, holding the box a little tighter against her chest. I was just leaving. I found an injured. I don't care what you found, Vanessa snapped, and several of the arriving guests, dressed in their finest, turned to watch. Do you have any idea what this day means? Do you have any idea how much this wedding cost? And you're standing on the dock in that uniform, while my guests are arriving. A few bridesmaids exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them, a younger woman named Katie, opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. I understand, Denise said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. I'll go now. But Vanessa wasn't finished. Something about having an audience, about feeling for just a moment like the queen of everything she surveyed, pulled something uglier out of her than she probably intended. Get out from our wedding, she shouted, loud enough that even the quartet stopped playing. This is my day. Do you understand? Not yours. Get off this dock before someone sees you and thinks you're supposed to be here. The words landed like a slap. Not just on Denise, but on everyone standing close enough to hear them. Denise didn't cry. She didn't argue. She had spent 3 years training herself not to react to moments exactly like this one. Moments where wealth mistook itself for permission to be cruel. She simply nodded once, turned, and continued walking down the dock, the box with a sleeping kitten cradled gently against her chest. But what none of them knew, what Vanessa in her white silk gown and her righteous fury had absolutely no idea of, was that Nathaniel Whitmore was standing at the top of the gangway. And he had heard every single word. He had come up from below deck just in time to see his fiancée scream at a woman for the crime of walking too slowly off a boat. Just in time to watch 200 of his guests stand frozen in stunned, awkward silence. Just in time to see the same woman he'd watched, less than 2 hours earlier, gently bandage the leg of an injured kitten with more compassion than he had felt directed at him in the past 6 months of wedding planning. His face didn't change. Not outwardly. But something inside him went very, very still. Vanessa, he said. His voice calm but carrying an edge no one on that deck had ever heard from him before. She turned, still flushed with adrenaline, expecting perhaps for him to agree with her, to back her up, to play the role he had always played. Supportive, agreeable, quietly absent from conflicts that didn't personally threaten him. Nathaniel, she said, straightening, smoothing her expression back into wedding day serenity. Sorry, darling, there was just a staff member who... I know what happened, he said. I heard all of it. Something flickered across Vanessa's face. The first hint, perhaps, of understanding that something had shifted. But she recovered quickly, the way people who are used to getting away with things always do. Well, it's handled now, she said, forcing a smile toward the gathering crowd of guests. Let's just... Denise, Nathaniel called out, his voice carrying clearly down the dock. Denise, halfway to the parking area, froze. She turned slowly, stunned that he knew her name at all. Please wait, he said. Come back up. I need to speak with you. 200 wedding guests dressed in their finest stood in absolute silence, watching the groom walk past his own bride to the top of the gangway. His eyes fixed not on Vanessa, but on the housekeeper she had just humiliated in front of everyone she had spent months trying to impress. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Whatever was about to happen next, everyone standing on that dock understood, instinctively, that it was going to change everything. Denise walked back up the gangway slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last, 200 pairs of eyes following her the entire way. She didn't understand what was happening. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and the kitten, sensing her tension, let out a soft mewl from inside the box she still cradled protectively. Mr. Whitmore, she said carefully, once she reached the top, keeping her voice low, professional. I'm so sorry for the disruption. I was just leaving. You don't need to apologize, Nathaniel said, and something in his tone made her look up at him properly for the first time. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't pitying either, the thing she had braced herself for. It was something closer to respect. I saw what happened downstairs this morning, he continued, quietly enough that only she and those closest to him could hear. With the kitten. I saw the way you took care of it. Nobody asked you to do that. Nobody would have known if you'd just walked past it. Denise blinked, caught completely off guard. It was hurt, she said simply, as if that explained everything, because to her it did. That's exactly my point, Nathaniel said. Behind him, Vanessa had made her way up as well, her wedding gown trailing behind her, her face a careful mask that was beginning at the edges to crack. Nathaniel, darling, we really don't have time for this. The ceremony is in. Vanessa, he said without turning around, I need you to understand something. And I need everyone here to understand it too. He turned finally, addressing not just her, but the entire deck, 200 guests, the string quartet, the photographer who had wisely lowered his camera and was simply watching, sensing that whatever was unfolding was more important than any posed photo he could take. 18 months ago, when Vanessa and I got engaged, Nathaniel said, his voice steady, carrying across the silent deck, my father told me something. He said the truest test of a person's character isn't how they treat you when you have something they want. It's how they treat someone who can give them absolutely nothing in return. His eyes moved to Denise, still standing there with her cardboard box, her pink uniform, her carefully composed face beginning, just slightly to tremble. This morning, he continued, I watched a woman who had every reason to walk past an injured animal, who had already finished her shift, who had every excuse in the world to simply leave. Stop, kneel down, and take care of something small and broken that nobody else would have even noticed. She didn't do it for recognition. She didn't do it because anyone was watching. She did it because it was the right thing to do. He paused, and the silence on that deck was so complete that Denise could hear her own heartbeat. And then, he said, his voice hardening slightly, I watched my fiancé scream at that same woman in front of 200 people for the crime of walking too slowly down a dock. Vanessa's face had gone pale. Nathaniel, that's not. I was just stressed. It's my wedding day. You can't possibly. I can, he said quietly. And I do. He turned back to Denise, and something in his expression softened, though the resolve behind it didn't waver. I've spent my entire life around people who know exactly how to behave when the cameras are on, he said. Vanessa is very good at that. I used to think that was enough. I used to think that grace under pressure, in front of an audience, was the same thing as genuine kindness. He shook his head slowly. It isn't. Real character is what a person does when they think no one important is watching. It's how they treat a housekeeper, stranger, an injured animal that can't even thank them. He looked at Vanessa one final time. I can't marry someone who screams at people she considers beneath her, he said quietly, but with a finality that echoed across the entire deck. I'm sorry. I know this is not how anyone expected today to go. But I would rather live with the embarrassment of this moment than spend the rest of my life married to someone who treats kindness as a weakness in others and cruelty as a privilege for herself. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, someone dropped a champagne glass, the sound of shattering crystal the only noise besides Nathaniel's steady voice. Vanessa's carefully composed mask finally, completely shattered. You're calling off the wedding. Now. In front of everyone. Because of a maid. Because of who you are when you think it doesn't matter, Nathaniel said. That's not on her. That's entirely on you. He turned to the stunned crowd, to the frozen quartet, to the photographer who had, at some point, quietly resumed shooting, because he understood instinctively that he was documenting something far more significant than a wedding. "I'm sorry to everyone who traveled here today," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying real regret, real weight. "This isn't the outcome any of us expected. But I would rather disappoint 200 guests today than spend a lifetime disappointed in the person I chose to spend it with." He turned back to Denise, who stood frozen, still clutching her box, utterly overwhelmed by what she had just witnessed and what she had, somehow unknowingly, caused. "I'm sorry you had to be part of this," he said softly, just to her. "You didn't ask for any of it. But I want you to know what you did this morning, the way you treated something small and broken with such care, that mattered. It mattered more than anything I've seen in the 18 months I spent planning this day." Denise, for the first time since arriving at the marina that morning, felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. "I was just doing what anyone would do," she whispered. Nathaniel shook his head slowly, a faint, sad smile crossing his face. "No," he said. "You weren't. That's exactly the point." Behind them, Vanessa had begun sobbing, her mascara running in dark streaks down her perfectly powdered cheeks. Her bridesmaids rushing to comfort her while the guests murmured in stunned confusion, unsure whether to leave, whether to stay, whether any of this was actually real. But for Denise, standing at the top of that gangway in her pink uniform, holding a sleeping kitten in a cardboard box, the world had just tilted on its axis in a way she could not yet fully comprehend. She had come to that yacht that morning expecting nothing more than another shift of invisible, thankless work. She had no idea that her small, quiet act of kindness had just unraveled an entire wedding, and was about to change the entire course of her life. The next 20 minutes were a blur of chaos that Denise would never fully piece back together in the right order. Guests began murmuring, then talking, then outright arguing among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Some sided quietly with Nathaniel, whispering that they'd always found Vanessa a little cold, a little too concerned with appearances. Others rushed to Vanessa's defense, calling the whole thing an overreaction, a public humiliation that no bride deserved on her wedding day, regardless of what she'd said in a moment of stress. Priscilla Vance, the wedding coordinator, stood frozen near the floral arch, her earpiece crackling with confused questions from vendors who had no idea whether to keep setting up or start tearing down. Vanessa, meanwhile, had been ushered below deck by her mother and 2 bridesmaids, her sobs echoing faintly up the stairwell. Her wedding, the wedding she had spent 18 months orchestrating down to the smallest detail, collapsing in real time in front of the exact social circle she had built it all to impress. Denise stood frozen near the top of the gangway, still holding her box, feeling like an intruder in a story that had, somehow, become about her. "I think," Nathaniel said quietly, appearing beside her again. His voice calmer now, though his hands, she noticed, were slightly unsteady. "I owe you an apology and also a great deal of gratitude, neither of which I can properly give you standing here, in the middle of all this." "You don't owe me anything," Denise said quickly. "I should go. I need to get this kitten checked by a vet, and I should let you handle." "Let me help with that at least," Nathaniel said. "Please. It's the least I can do, considering the morning you've had because of my wedding. My almost wedding." Denise hesitated. Every instinct she had, honed over 3 years of learning her place in spaces like this, told her to decline, to disappear quietly, to let the wealthy people sort out their wealthy problems without her. But there was something in Nathaniel's eyes. An exhaustion, a rawness, a genuine sincerity that didn't match the careless cruelty she'd expected from people in his world, that made her pause. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you." He arranged, within minutes, for one of the family's drivers to take Denise and the kitten to the nearest emergency veterinary clinic, insisting on covering every cost himself. Denise tried to protest, But Nathaniel simply shook his head. "You took care of something helpless without being asked," he said. "The least I can do is make sure it's properly taken care of now." As she climbed into the car, kitten box in her lap, Denise looked back at the yacht one final time. Flowers still cascading over every railing, string quartet instruments now silent and abandoned, 200 guests slowly filtering off the boat in stunned, hushed clusters, whispering about what they'd just witnessed. She had walked onto that dock that morning as an invisible woman in a pink uniform. She was leaving it as the center of a story that would, by evening, be circulating through every corner of Fort Lauderdale's social scene. And though she couldn't have known it yet, well beyond it. At the veterinary clinic, the kitten, a small gray female Denise had already, quietly, begun to think of as lucky, was examined, treated properly, and given a clean bill of health beyond the minor leg wound Denise had already tended to. "Whoever did the initial bandaging did a good job," the vet told her, glancing over the wound. "You a nurse or something?" Denise smiled faintly, exhausted. "No. Just someone who couldn't walk past her." She sat in the clinic's waiting room afterward, the adrenaline of the morning finally draining out of her, replaced by a bone-deep tiredness and a strange, hollow disbelief at everything that had happened. She kept replaying Vanessa's voice in her head, "Get out from our wedding," and then, immediately after, Nathaniel's, "Real character is what a person does when they think no one important is watching." She didn't know what to feel. Humiliated, still, from being screamed at in front of 200 strangers. Confused at having somehow become the centerpiece of a cancelled billion-dollar wedding. And underneath it all, something she couldn't quite name. A small, quiet warmth at having been seen, truly seen, by someone whose world had never once acknowledged hers before. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister, Angela, who worked as a hostess at a restaurant 2 towns over. "Girl, are you okay? People are saying a bride screamed at a maid on a yacht and the groom called off the wedding on the spot." "Was that you?" Denise stared at the message for a long moment, stunned. News traveled that fast. She didn't even know yet that the photographer, the one who had quietly kept shooting through the entire confrontation, had already sold a handful of the most striking images to a local entertainment blog, which had, within hours, been picked up by national outlets hungry for exactly the kind of story that made people stop scrolling. The billionaire who chose kindness over cruelty, and the mystery maid, whose quiet act of compassion had upended it all. By that evening, Denise Coleman, a name almost nobody outside her small circle had ever bothered to learn, was trending. And she had absolutely no idea what was coming next. The next morning, Denise woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. She lived in a modest 1-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood 20 minutes inland from the marina, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the rent kept creeping higher every year. But it was hers, and she'd worked hard to keep it that way after her divorce 3 years earlier had left her starting over from almost nothing. She sat up in bed, Lucky the kitten curled against her side. She'd asked and been granted permission to keep her, since nobody at the marina had claimed her, and scrolled through her phone in growing disbelief. News articles. Dozens of them. Billionaire calls off wedding after fiancé humiliates housekeeper. The maid who stopped a billion-dollar wedding. Kindness versus cruelty. The yacht scandal rocking Fort Lauderdale's elite. There were photos, the photographer's images spreading across every platform, of Vanessa mid-scream, finger pointed accusingly down at Denise on the dock. Of Nathaniel standing at the top of the gangway, his expression unreadable. Of Denise herself, frozen, cardboard box in her arms, looking impossibly small against the towering white yacht behind her. Her comment sections were flooded, some people calling her a hero, praising her composure and grace. Others, disturbingly, speculating wildly about who she was, whether she'd planned the whole thing, whether she was secretly some kind of gold digger who had orchestrated the entire scenario to catch Nathaniel Whitmore's attention. Denise felt sick reading it. She had done nothing except bandage an injured animal and absorb someone else's cruelty with as much dignity as she could manage. And now her face, her name, her entire private life was being picked apart by strangers on the internet who knew absolutely nothing about her. Her phone rang again. This time she recognized the number. Marina Cleaning Solutions, her employer. "Denise," said her supervisor's voice, tight and clipped, the moment she answered. "I need you to come into the office today." Her stomach dropped. "Is everything okay?" "We need to talk about your employment," the woman said, and something in her tone told Denise everything she needed to know before another word was spoken. "The Whitmore family has been one of our most important clients for over a decade. This situation has created a lot of complications for us. A lot of unwanted attention." "I didn't do anything wrong," Denise said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "I found an injured animal and helped it. That's all." "I understand," her supervisor said, though her tone suggested she didn't, not really. "But the optics of this are difficult for the company. I'm sorry, Denise. We're going to have to let you go." The call ended before Denise could fully process what had just happened. She sat on the edge of her bed, phone still in her hand, Lucky purring softly beside her, and felt something crack quietly open in her chest. Not rage exactly, but a deep, weary grief that had nothing to do with losing a job she'd never particularly loved, and everything to do with the bitter unfairness of a world where doing the right thing had somehow cost her the only steady income she had. 3 years of reliable, thankless work. Gone in a 5-minute phone call, because a woman with far more money and far less character had decided to humiliate her in public, and the fallout had landed, as it so often did, on the person with the least power in the room. She put her face in her hands and, for the first time since the entire ordeal began, allowed herself to cry. She didn't hear the knock at her apartment door 20 minutes later. It was Lucky's soft mewl of alarm that finally pulled her attention toward it. Denise wiped her face, composed herself as best she could, and opened the door to find a man in a plain gray suit. No branding, no obvious wealth signifiers, standing quietly in her hallway. "Miss Coleman," he said politely. "My name is Robert Ainsley. I work for Nathaniel Whitmore. He asked me to come find you personally. He'd like to speak with you if you're willing." Denise stared at him, exhausted, wary, still raw from the phone call 20 minutes earlier. "Why?" she asked simply. Robert offered a small, kind smile. "Honestly, Ms. Coleman, I think he wants to make things right." Denise almost said no. Standing there in her apartment doorway, eyes still red from crying, she had every reason in the world to close the door and tell this polite stranger in the gray suit that she wanted absolutely nothing more to do with the Whitmore family, the wedding, or the chaos that had, in less than 24 hours, cost her a job and her privacy and quite possibly her peace of mind. But something, exhaustion, curiosity, or perhaps some quiet instinct that this wasn't finished yet, made her hesitate. "Give me a minute," she said finally, and closed the door gently to grab her coat. Robert drove her not to the marina, but to a modest office building downtown, surprisingly unassuming for a Whitmore property, all clean lines and warm wood, nothing like the ostentatious yacht she'd stood on the day before. Nathaniel was waiting in a small conference room, no entourage, no assistants hovering, just him in a simple button-down shirt, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the emotional wreckage of the last 24 hours. "Thank you for coming," he said, standing as she entered. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Denise admitted, taking the seat he offered. "I understand," he said. "And I'm sorry, genuinely sorry, for everything my wedding and Vanessa and this entire mess has cost you. I heard what happened with your job this morning." Denise's eyes widened slightly. How did you? I make it my business to know when someone's been hurt because of a situation I created, he said simply. Even indirectly. He slid a folder across the table toward her. Denise opened it hesitantly and found, to her utter astonishment, an employment offer. Not for cleaning. Not for any service role at all. Director of the Whitmore Family Foundation. Animal Welfare and Community Outreach Division. I don't understand, Denise said slowly, staring at the document. After yesterday, Nathaniel said, I did a lot of thinking. My family's foundation gives away millions of dollars a year to various causes, but honestly, most of it happens at arm's length. Committees, board approvals, photo ops. It doesn't feel like it comes from anywhere real. He leaned forward. What I saw you do yesterday, kneeling down for a creature that couldn't thank you, that nobody would have known about if you hadn't stepped in. That's exactly the kind of instinct I want driving our foundation's work. Not performative charity. Real compassion, from someone who understands what it means to have very little and still give generously anyway. I have no experience running a foundation, Denise said honestly, still stunned. I clean boats for a living. Cleaned, she corrected herself bitterly. Past tense, as of this morning. You have something far more valuable than a business degree, Nathaniel said. You have character. I can teach anyone spreadsheets and grant applications. I can't teach someone to be the kind of person who stops what they're doing to bandage an injured kitten's leg with a stranger's supplies, knowing it might get them in trouble. Denise sat in silence for a long moment, turning the folder over in her hands, her mind racing through 1,000 conflicting emotions. Disbelief, hope, suspicion, exhaustion. Why does this feel like it's happening because you feel guilty, she said finally, more bluntly than she intended. And not because you actually think I'm right for this. Nathaniel didn't flinch from the question. If anything, he looked relieved by it, as if he'd been waiting for someone to finally speak to him honestly, without the careful diplomacy everyone in his world always used. Both things can be true, he said. I do feel responsible for what happened to you. But that's not why I'm offering you this. I'm offering it because yesterday, in the middle of the worst day of my life, you reminded me what actual decency looks like. That's rare. That's worth building something around. Denise looked down at the folder again. The salary listed there alone was nearly double what she'd made in a year of cleaning yachts. But it wasn't the number that made her chest tighten. It was the description beneath her potential title. Overseeing direct impact programs for underserved families, shelter animals, and community welfare initiatives across South Florida. It was, she realized slowly, almost exactly the work she used to dream about doing, back before life. A difficult marriage, a harder divorce, bills that never seemed to stop arriving, had narrowed her ambitions down to simply surviving 1 week at a time. I need to think about it, she said quietly. Take all the time you need, Nathaniel said. But Denise, whatever you decide, I want you to know that what happened yesterday wasn't your fault. Not the wedding falling apart. Not losing your job. None of it. You did something quietly kind, and someone else's cruelty turned it into a spectacle. That's not a reflection of your character. It's a reflection of hers. Denise nodded slowly, throat tight, and for the first time since the chaos began, she allowed herself to feel something other than exhaustion and grief. She felt quietly, cautiously, hope. Denise didn't accept the job that day. She took the folder home, sat with it for 3 full days, turning it over in her hands more times than she could count, wrestling with a question that went far deeper than salary or job title. She had spent her entire adult life being underestimated, overlooked in rooms exactly like the one she'd stood in on that yacht, present, useful, invisible. She had built an entire identity around simply doing her job well, and expecting nothing more than a paycheck in return. The idea of stepping into a role like this, of being seen, of having her name attached to real decisions that could genuinely help people, terrified her almost as much as it excited her. On the third night, her sister Angela came over, and the two of them sat on Denise's small couch, Lucky curled contentedly between them, while Denise finally voiced the fear that had been sitting in her chest since the moment she'd read the job offer. "What if they're just doing this for the publicity?" Denise asked quietly. "What if I take this job and in 6 months, once the stories died down, once nobody's writing articles about it anymore, they quietly let me go, and I've walked away from a job I actually understood how to do?" Angela considered this carefully, the way she always did before offering advice. Angela had never been one to rush. "Maybe," she said finally. "That's possible. Rich people do things like that sometimes. Grand gestures that fade the second the cameras stop rolling." She reached over and squeezed her sister's hand. "But Denise, you didn't do what you did yesterday for a job offer. You didn't kneel down and bandage that kitten's leg hoping someone rich would notice and reward you for it. You did it because it's who you are. That hasn't changed, whether you take this job or not." Pause. "The real question isn't whether they're being genuine. It's whether you believe you're capable of doing something bigger than what you've let yourself believe you deserved. Because from where I'm sitting, sis, you've been capable of this kind of work your whole life. Nobody just handed you compassion yesterday. You've always had it. Maybe it's time somebody finally gave you the platform to use it properly." Denise sat with that for a long time after Angela left, staring at the folder on her coffee table, Lucky curled asleep against her leg, the apartment quiet around her. The next morning she called Robert Ainsley and asked for one meeting. Not with lawyers, not with paperwork, but with Nathaniel himself alone, to ask the questions she still needed answered before she could truly decide. He agreed immediately. They met at a small diner near her apartment this time. Nathaniel's choice, not hers, which surprised her. No fancy restaurant, no boardroom. Just a booth, 2 cups of coffee, and honesty. "I need to know something," Denise said once they'd settled in. "If I take this job and in a year the story's forgotten and I'm just another employee at your foundation, will you still value what I bring to it? Or was this only ever about making yourself look good after a very public, very embarrassing wedding collapse?" Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, considering the question with the same seriousness he'd given to breaking off his engagement in front of 200 people. "Honestly," he said finally, "I can't promise you I won't get some benefit from the story, the publicity, the optics of hiring you. I'd be lying if I said that consideration wasn't part of it, at least initially. My family's world runs on image, whether I like it or not." Denise's jaw tightened slightly, bracing for disappointment. "But," he continued, "that's not why I'm still here, 3 days later, having this conversation with you instead of letting my PR team quietly handle a donation and move on. I'm here because I meant every word I said about character. I've spent my whole life around people who know how to perform kindness for an audience. You showed me what it looks like when nobody's watching. That's not something I'm interested in letting slip away just because the news cycle moves on to the next story." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking you to trust me completely, Denise. I know I haven't earned that yet. I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove it, through actions, not promises. Take the job. If in 6 months you feel like you're just a headline to me, walk away. And I'll give you a full year severance and the best reference letter you've ever seen. But I don't think that's what's going to happen." Denise studied him for a long moment. This man who, 3 days earlier, had appended his entire life in front of 200 witnesses because of something he'd seen a stranger do with an injured kitten. "Okay," she said finally, quietly. "I'll take it." Nathaniel smiled. The first genuine, unguarded smile she'd seen from him since this entire strange chapter of both their lives had begun. "Okay," he echoed. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet diner booth, just how much that single word was about to change. 6 months passed. Denise threw herself into the work with a ferocity that surprised even her. She restructured the foundation's animal welfare programs from the ground up, partnering with local shelters across South Florida, establishing low-cost veterinary clinics in underserved neighborhoods, launching a program that paired at-risk teens with shelter dogs for training and companionship, something she dreamed up herself, remembering how much stability and purpose caring for Lucky had given her during the most chaotic weeks of her life. She was good at it. Genuinely, undeniably good. Not because of some corporate MBA training, but because she understood on a bone-deep level what it felt like to be overlooked, underestimated, and treated as disposable. Every program she built carried that understanding woven through it. The foundation's community outreach numbers doubled within her first 4 months. Local news outlets, the same ones that had once treated her as a viral curiosity, the mystery Maid, now interviewed her as a genuine authority, a community leader building real, tangible change. Nathaniel, true to his word, never once made her feel like a headline. He gave her real authority, real budget, real trust, stepping back and letting her build the programs her way, only stepping in when she specifically asked for his input or his family's resources. Somewhere in those 6 months, without either of them quite noticing the exact moment it happened, something else had also quietly shifted. Started small. Nathaniel stopping by her office not for foundation business, but simply to ask how Lucky was adjusting to her new cat tree. Denise texting him a photo of a shelter dog they'd just placed with a veteran family, captioned only with 3 exclamation points, because some victories didn't need explaining. Long conversations after board meetings that had nothing to do with grant proposals and everything to do with childhoods, regrets, the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people yet feeling completely unseen. Neither of them acknowledged it out loud. Not for a long time. Nathaniel was still, technically, recovering from the public collapse of an 18-month engagement. Denise was still cautious, still bruised from a divorce that had taught her not to trust easily, still wary of a world that had, only months earlier, tried to erase her entirely for the crime of being kind in public. But slowly, unmistakably, something warm and real had begun growing between them. Not the kind of love built on galas and yacht weddings and carefully curated public image, but the quiet, steady kind, built in diner booths and shelter visits and long conversations about nothing in particular that somehow meant everything. It was Denise, in the end, who said something first. 6 months and 11 days after that chaotic morning on the Serenity, standing in the newly renovated community shelter the foundation had just opened, watching Nathaniel kneel down on the floor to gently greet an elderly, 3-legged shelter dog nobody else wanted to adopt. "You know," she said, watching him carefully, "the first time I saw real kindness from you, it wasn't the wedding or firing your fiancé in front of 200 people. It was watching you talk to that old dog just now like he mattered exactly as much as any healthy puppy in this building." Nathaniel looked up at her, smiling slightly. Everyone deserves to feel like they matter. Even the ones nobody else is choosing. Denise felt her chest tighten, the words landing somewhere deep and unexpected. "That's exactly how I felt," she said quietly, "the day you stopped a wedding for me." Nathaniel stood slowly, brushing off his knees, studying her with an intensity that made the busy shelter around them fade into background noise. "I didn't stop the wedding for you," he said gently. "I stopped it because of who Vanessa revealed herself to be in that moment. But everything since then, every day I've spent working alongside you, watching you build something real out of nothing, that's when I started falling for who you actually are." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unhurried. Nothing like the performative grandeur of the wedding that had, 6 months earlier, fallen apart in front of the entire world. This felt different, quieter, truer. "I'm scared," Denise admitted softly. "Of what people will say. Of being called a gold digger, or a headline, or someone who orchestrated all of this somehow." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I'm scared too. Of repeating old mistakes, of not being able to tell the difference between someone who loves who I am and someone who loves what I have." He reached for her hand, gently, giving her every chance to pull away if she needed to. "But I don't think either of us has to be scared of that with each other," he said. "Because we already know, better than anyone, exactly how this began. Not with roses or diamonds or a yacht. With a kitten with a hurt leg, and someone who couldn't walk past it." Denise laughed softly through unexpected tears, squeezing his hand. "That's a strange love story," she admitted. "Maybe," Nathaniel said, smiling. "But it's the realest one I've ever been part of." Word spread quickly once again, though this time, Denise found she didn't mind quite as much. The story of the maid who stopped a billionaire's wedding resurfaced across news outlets and social media, now with a new chapter attached. The quiet, 6-month-long transformation from public humiliation to genuine partnership, culminating in whispers, then confirmations, that Nathaniel Whitmore and Denise Coleman were, in fact, together. Not everyone was kind about it. Old comment sections resurfaced, filled with cynical accusations, that Denise had planned the whole thing from the start, that she'd manipulated her way into Nathaniel's world using a viral moment and a convenient kitten. Gossip columns speculated wildly, some outright cruel, painting her as a modern-day fortune hunter who had simply played her cards perfectly. Denise, for the first time, found she had the strength to let most of it roll off her. "They don't know the full story," Nathaniel told her one evening, finding her scrolling through another cynical article with a tight jaw. "They weren't there. They didn't watch you not know I was watching. They didn't see 6 months of you building real programs, helping real families, saving real animals, long before either of us admitted what was happening between us." "I know," Denise said quietly. "It still stings, though. Being reduced to a scheme, when all I did was refuse to walk past something hurting." "Then let's show them who you actually are," Nathaniel said. "Not through a statement or a press release. Through the work." And so, together they did exactly that. They expanded the Foundation's programs even further, launching a scholarship initiative specifically for domestic workers and their children, something deeply personal to Denise, who remembered exactly how invisible and unsupported she had felt during her hardest years. They opened 2 more low-cost veterinary clinics in underserved neighborhoods. They created a mentorship program connecting service industry workers with career development resources, something Denise designed personally, drawing directly from the years she'd spent feeling like her potential had been permanently capped by her circumstances. Vanessa, for her part, largely disappeared from public life in the months following the cancelled wedding, resurfacing only occasionally in gossip columns. Her attempts to reframe the narrative, painting herself as the true victim of an overblown, unfair viral moment, gaining little traction against the growing body of evidence, quite literally built brick by brick through Denise's tangible community work, of exactly who deserved public sympathy and who didn't. 1 year to the day after the wedding that never happened, Nathaniel and Denise stood together at the grand opening of the Foundation's newest project, a fully funded community center offering free childcare, job training, veterinary services, and emergency assistance to working families across South Florida, built on the same marina property, ironically, where the Serenity had once been docked. Local news cameras gathered, but this time, the story wasn't about scandal or spectacle. It was about impact, real, measurable, lasting impact, built by 2 people who had found each other not through grand gestures, but through quiet acts of decency that had, almost accidentally, changed both their lives forever. "A year ago," Nathaniel said during his brief remarks at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Denise standing beside him, I stood on a yacht not far from here and made a decision that cost me a wedding, a fair amount of public embarrassment, and for a while, a great deal of uncertainty about what my life would look like going forward." He glanced at Denise, smiling. "But it gave me something far more valuable than any of that. It showed me what real character looks like. Not the kind performed for an audience, but the kind that exists quietly, consistently, even when nobody important is supposedly watching. This community center exists because one woman refused to walk past something small and broken and helpless, on a morning when everyone around her was far too consumed with appearances to notice or care." He took Denise's hand. "That's the world I want this foundation to build. One where kindness isn't a performance, and where the people who show up quietly, consistently, without needing recognition, finally get the recognition and the resources they've always deserved." The crowd applauded. Somewhere near the front, Angela wiped tears from her eyes, watching her sister. The same sister who, 1 year earlier, had been screamed at on a dock and fired from her cleaning job within 24 hours, cut the ribbon on a building that would change hundreds of lives in their community for years to come. 2 years after the wedding that never happened, Denise Coleman stood once again on a dock overlooking the Fort Lauderdale marina, though everything about the moment was different this time. She wasn't wearing a pink uniform. She wasn't carrying cleaning supplies. She wasn't invisible, overlooked, or bracing herself for someone else's cruelty. She wore a simple ivory dress, understated and elegant, nothing like the elaborate silk gown that had once dominated headlines for entirely the wrong reasons. Around her stood not 200 curated wedding guests chosen for social status, but close friends, family, shelter volunteers, formerly homeless families who'd found stability through the Foundation's programs, and staff from the community center that now bore her name on its dedication plaque. Nathaniel stood across from her, dressed simply, his eyes glistening with an emotion he made no effort to hide. Lucky, now a full-grown, thoroughly spoiled cat who had somehow ended up as the unofficial mascot of the Whitmore Foundation, sat in a small basket near the front row, wearing, at Angela's insistence, a tiny bow tie for the occasion. There was no elaborate floral arch imported from overseas. No string quartet flown in from Europe. Just a simple gathering of people who had watched, over 2 years, the genuine, unglamorous work of two people building something real. Both a foundation that had changed thousands of lives, and a relationship built not on image, but on shared values and quiet, consistent kindness. 2 years ago, Nathaniel said during his vows, his voice thick with emotion, I stood on a boat not far from this exact spot and made the hardest decision of my life. Walking away from a wedding in front of everyone I knew, because I finally understood what real character looked like, and I couldn't unsee the difference between performance and genuine goodness. He looked at Denise, tears now openly visible. I didn't know in that moment that I was also making the best decision of my life. I didn't know that the woman I just watched get humiliated for showing kindness to something small and broken would become the person who taught me more about what actually matters. Not wealth, not status, not appearances, than anyone else I'd ever known. Denise, her own eyes bright with tears, squeezed his hands. You gave me back something I didn't even realize I'd lost, she said when it was her turn. For years, I believed my worth was tied to how useful I could be to people who barely saw me as a person. You saw me, really saw me, on a day when I expected nothing more than to finish my shift and go home unnoticed, the way I always had. She glanced toward the crowd, toward Angela, toward the families whose lives had been changed by programs she'd built from nothing but empathy and determination, toward the community center bustling with life just visible beyond the dock. What we've built together, she continued, started with a kitten with a hurt leg and a moment of cruelty that could have destroyed me, but instead became the beginning of everything good in my life since. I used to think kindness was something you did quietly, hoping no one important ever noticed. Now I understand the world needs to see it. Not for applause, but because it reminds everyone else that it's still possible. As they exchanged rings, simple, understated, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry once associated with Nathaniel's world, the small crowd erupted into genuine, joyful applause, entirely unlike the stunned, uncomfortable silence that had once fallen over that same marina 2 years earlier. Sometimes the smallest moments of our lives, a moment of kindness nobody asks us to show, a decision to help something helpless when it would be so much easier to walk away, end up becoming the foundation for everything that follows. Denise never set out to stop a wedding. She never set out to build a foundation, to fall in love with a man from a completely different world, or to become a symbol of quiet decency in the face of public cruelty. She simply refused to walk past something that needed her, even when nobody was watching, even when it cost her everything she thought she had. And in the end, that single choice changed not just her own life, but hundreds of lives across an entire community. If this story touched you today, I want you to remember this. You never know which small act of kindness, offered quietly and without expectation of reward, might end up being the moment that changes everything. Not just for someone else, but for you too. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video. It truly helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel if you want more emotional, real, heart-touching stories like this one. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters, even when no one's watching, please share this with them. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.